Hi, Mr. Comey. Real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for making the time.
Oh, it's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
The main character in your book, Nora, is, from what I've heard you say already, loosely based on your daughter, who happens to be a federal prosecutor. I have a number of questions for you about the book. Once again, it's called Westport in a moment, but I do want to just start off with the big news this week. I saw an interview you conducted a few days before the verdict in which you said you thought the prosecution had landed their case. Why do you think they convinced jurors Trump was guilty?
Because they built a case brick by brick that was not really subject to cross-examination. It was documents, it was text, it was the defendant's own words. And then they followed it up with their cooperating witness, Michael Cohen. But by that point, they had built such a strong house that they might have won the case without Cohen. That's why I thought it's highly likely to be a conviction, maybe a hung jury, but zero chance of acquittal.
You spent your life in law enforcement and in the legal world. How significant do you think the verdict is?
It's big for the American people to see a civics lesson, that this is what the rule of law looks like, that you may brag that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose supporters, but you'll be held accountable, and this is what accountability looks like. This is how it works. And so it's another example, I think, of all the flaws in American society. The shining light over the last few years has been our culture around our law enforcement, around our civil courts. Our court system has passed its stress test.
You actually wrote about that concept, broadly speaking, recently in the Washington Post. You wrote, "We must not let the idea of Trumpian violence become some kind of boogeyman, frightening us away from our commitment to the rule of law." His rhetoric following this verdict, even preceding it, is particularly amped up around calling it rigged, a disgrace, et cetera, although not providing any evidence. That's the claims he's making. And his supporters, the rhetoric of his supporters is also ramped up. Does that change your conclusion at all?
No. I mean, I'm still very worried about individual acts of violence and threats because it's become the way of operating in the MAGA world. So I'm very concerned about poll workers and city council people who get threatened. We shouldn't take that lightly. I still am not concerned about large-scale Trumpian violence. I don't think he has the ability to motivate people to those acts anymore, especially after the message that our justice system sent to those who sacked the Capitol on January 6th. This will ruin your life if you engage in this kind of stuff.
How do you think that will inform the way in which things unfold going forward in the lead up to this election?
Trump is going to do what he has done since he entered public life. He's going to take a flamethrower to anything he sees as a threat, and the rule of law is a threat to someone who has engaged in as much criminal conduct as he has. So he'll continue to try and burn it all down. His supporters, because I know people and have done fraud cases, they're trapped. Very hard to escape a fraud or a cult because it requires you to admit something about yourself that's very, very painful. And if they didn't leave this cult after January the 6th, the poor people can't get out. What I hope, as Lincoln was fond of saying, there's always just enough virtue to save America. And in the independent voters and those who for some reason haven't made up their mind, they have the information they need to be part of that virtue that saves America in November.
Do you have a sense, and I would ask this question, I guess, not even in your more official capacity, but in the life that you've led since, when you interact with other Americans, do you have a sense that this conviction will change someone's vote, will impart a different view of the election on the group of voters who have yet to decide?
I think so. I don't know to what extent. It's another brick in the load of the picture that is this man whose former cabinet officials have said by the dozen should never be allowed near the Oval Office again. That message needs to get through to the American people. There shouldn't be any low information voters in America in November. And this is another piece of information that I hope will be useful to those who already haven't made up their minds.
Do you think it's possible he wins?
Oh, sure, it's possible. Hate to say that about my own country, but sure. I think it's very unlikely, but I think it's possible.
Let's switch gears very dramatically to your book, Westport, as I mentioned. It's your second Nora Carlton thriller. This time she's left her job in the U.S. Attorney's Office. She's living a calmer life until a coworker is murdered and she becomes the lead suspect. You write thrillers, but I was listening to another interview you gave about your writing, and you talked about how you aren't in the quote-unquote make stuff up business when you write. In what way did that impart, or what did that impart, I should say, on your writing in this book?
Well, obviously I'm writing fiction, so they're not true stories. But what I meant by that is I try to write worlds that I know, because one of the ways I hope my books are useful is showing people what institutions are like that they might not otherwise get a chance to go inside of. So I'm hoping I'm producing some of the most real fiction you'll ever read. It feels the way that world I've put my characters in feels. The procedures are real. The excitement is the kind of excitement that's really generated in these places. And so that's what I mean when I say I try to hew to the real world in writing fiction.
And what's your attachment to this protagonist? I mentioned off the top that she's loosely based on your daughter, but why are you drawn back to her?
Well, because because it's a labor of love to picture her, to close my eyes. It's really a combination of a number of my kids, but especially my oldest, who is a federal prosecutor in Manhattan as we speak. That's her job right now. And so writing it in that way helps me keep the character online, because the trouble with fiction is it can drift. Their tone drifts and their personality can drift. It helps me keep it online. And she's doing things that are in worlds that I used to work in. And so I'm able to connect my own experience with people that I care deeply about.
And speaking of that, there's a bit of a Canadian connection. Nora's last name is Carleton, and I understand that has something to do with a post-secondary institution here in Ottawa.
Yeah, I lived in college. I've actually never told anyone this in an interview. I lived in college with a guy who fell in love with a Canadian woman and moved to Canada, and they still live with their children and grandchildren in Ottawa. And we went to visit her, and she was taking, I think, graduate classes at Carleton University or Carleton College. I forget what it was called then. And when I was trying to come up with a last name for Nora, that popped in my head. And so that's what I went with.
Are there more Nora books in the future for you?
Yes, I'm just finishing and getting the final round of family feedback on the third book, which is coming out a year from now, where Nora and her friends and partners are grappling with domestic extremist violence in a case in New York City.
Any reason you chose that subject?
Because unfortunately, it will still be current a year from now in America. I wish I could predict, well, it'll be viewed as old-fashioned in May of 2025. Even if Donald Trump, and I believe he will be, is defeated, we're still going to grapple with that challenge in America for a long time.
Mr. Comey, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate you making the time for the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.